In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women operated what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home. Those who did came back, changed. The Maine State Archives contain testimony from one survivor that was so disturbing, authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears, America's most horrifying medical experiment, disguised as Christian charity. This is a true story of systematic torture, illegal brain surgery, and human experimentation that makes modern horror films look tame. Warning: this historical true crime documentary contains graphic details about medical abuse, human experimentation, and violence against women. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we dive into this shocking chapter of American history, let me introduce myself. This channel is dedicated to exposing the darkest mysteries, true crime cases, and buried historical secrets that powerful people tried to erase forever. We investigate unsolved mysteries from American history, true crime cases that were covered up, disturbing medical experiments hidden from the public, historical horrors that textbooks won't teach, real paranormal investigations with historical evidence. If you're fascinated by true crime documentaries, historical mysteries, and dark true stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history, smash that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Comment below. What state are you watching from? Are you brave enough to join our community of 500,000 plus truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront the darkest corners of history? Let's uncover the truth together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of medical knowledge at any human cost. Hidden behind a facade of Christian charity, the setting, frontier America. The year is 1798. The District of Maine is still part of Massachusetts, a lawless wilderness territory where isolated communities struggle to survive harsh winters and even harsher realities. Millbridge, a coastal town of barely 300 souls, serves as a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen brave enough to navigate the treacherous Atlantic waters. 15 miles inland, through dense forest marked only by Native American hunting trails, lies a parcel of land that will become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The arrival of the Ashford women on a gray October morning in 1798. 3 mysterious women arrive in Millbridge. Their horse-drawn wagon is loaded with suspicious crates and medical supplies that immediately draw curious glances from townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha. Ashford steps down from the wagon with the bearing of European nobility. At 40 years old, she's a striking woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating gray eyes that seem to catalog every detail around her. Her voice carries the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggests someone accustomed to absolute command and obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerges next. A tall, gaunt woman of 30 with alabaster skin and hands that move with the precise grace of a master surgeon. Her fingers are long, pale, and unnaturally steady. Unlike Mother Superior, Prudence speaks little, observing the world through pale blue eyes that reveal nothing. When she does speak, her voice holds traces of a cultured Scottish accent, but with an underlying coldness that makes even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. Novice Temperance Ashford, the youngest at 22, possesses a haunting beauty: raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seem to hold ancient secrets. But there's something deeply unsettling about her beauty. Mothers instinctively pull their children closer when she passes. Her smile never reaches her eyes, and she has an unnerving habit of studying people as if they were specimens in a laboratory collection. The cover story. The Ashford women claim to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking to establish a new religious order in the American wilderness. They carry impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents that will later be revealed as masterful forgeries. Their story is compelling, enough to satisfy the Protestant community of Millbridge, who view the presence of educated religious women as a civilizing influence on their rough frontier settlement. The sinister construction, with gold coins that seem inexhaustible, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow, paying 3 times the land's assessed value. This ensures enthusiastic cooperation from local authorities. They immediately hire every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to construct their religious retreat. But the building that rises from the wilderness over 8 months is unlike any religious structure the workers have ever seen. 3 stories of gray stone with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within, unusually small windows positioned high on walls, making it impossible to see inside. Extensive basement excavation with reinforced foundations, far beyond what's needed for storage. Reinforced doors with heavy locks throughout. The facility drainage systems that could handle large volumes of liquid. Ventilation shafts more appropriate for a medical facility than a convent when questioned about the unusual architecture. Mother Superior Agatha explains with a serene smile. Penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is completely removed from worldly distractions. Most workers accept this explanation, though some privately wonder why a house of God needs to look so much like a fortress or a prison. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the first accomplice, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the circuit physician traveling between frontier settlements, becomes the sisters' earliest and most enthusiastic supporter. A man in his 50s with a reputation for progressive medical thinking, Dr. Hartwell is immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of feminine psychology and mental disorders. During their first meeting, he's amazed by their sophisticated understanding of conditions that most physicians barely recognize. He writes in his journal, "These sisters possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia. Their methods, while unconventional, are based on sound medical principles that I fear are decades ahead of current American practice." But what Dr. Hartwell doesn't record is the private conversation about financial arrangements. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing medical supplies, Dr. Hartwell will receive substantial monthly payments, access to detailed case studies for his medical career, a share in the experimental findings for a struggling frontier physician. It's an offer too valuable to refuse. The perfect victims. The convent's reputation spreads throughout the territory with remarkable speed. Families from settlements as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston begin hearing whispered recommendations about the Ashford sisters' miraculous ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost is steep. $20 silver dollars for 1 month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, $100 for complete reformation. But for desperate families dealing with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seems a small price to pay. Who were the victims? The types of women sent to the convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to reveal their lovers' identities, wives who had publicly challenged their husband's authority, daughters who rejected arranged marriages, women who showed too much interest in books, politics, or education, religious dissenters who questioned accepted doctrines, widows who refused to remarry according to family wishes, the common thread, defiance women who had somehow stepped outside. The narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior in Puritan society, the international network. What makes this case even more disturbing is the scale of the operation. The Ashford sisters weren't operating in isolation. They were part of an international network of rogue medical researchers. Correspondence later discovered reveals connections to universities in Edinburgh, Scotland, medical institutions in Vienna, Austria research facilities in Berlin, Germany, academic circles in Paris. France, the sisters were receiving regular shipments of advanced medical texts, surgical instruments unavailable in America, chemical compounds for experiments, payment for their research findings. They were also sending out detailed experimental reports, preserved biological specimens, surgical technique documentation, case studies of human brain modification, Mother Superior. Agatha began making monthly trips to Portland and Boston, always returning with crates of supplies that required careful handling. She explained to curious locals that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders, combining traditional spiritual healing with the latest advances in European medical science. Her cultured manner and obvious education made these explanations seem plausible to a community that valued both religious faith and scientific progress. But some residents remained deeply suspicious. Thomas Brewster's horrifying discovery. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803. 20-year-old trapper, Thomas Brewster was hunting in the forest surrounding the mysterious institution, tracking a wounded deer for hours through snow-laden wilderness, when unusual sounds drew his attention toward the stone building looming dark against the winter sky. Thomas had grown up in these woods and knew every natural sound, the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But what he heard that night was different, deeply wrong, and unmistakably human. Through the snow-heavy air came screaming that rose and fell in waves, sometimes dying to desperate whimpers before exploding again into raw, primal shrieks of agony that made his blood freeze. The basement, horror abandoning his wounded prey, Thomas crept closer to the convent, his heart pounding as the terrible sounds continued. The building appeared completely dark from outside, but as he circled toward the rear, he noticed a faint glow from basement windows, partially hidden by snowdrifts. Through a partially frosted window, Thomas glimpsed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into a surgical theater, brilliantly illuminated by dozens of oil lamps and candles casting dancing shadows on stone walls. A woman was secured to a wooden table with leather restraints, her head held immobile by a metal apparatus that looked more like a medieval torture device than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her usually pale face flushed with concentration as she manipulated what appeared to be a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head was partially shaved, revealing pale scalp marked with dark lines drawn in ink. Most horrifying of all, there was clearly an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone and something darker underneath that he realized with sick horror was brain tissue, the screaming woman's. Eyes were wide with terror and pain. But what made the scene even more nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as if documenting a routine medical procedure. Novice Temperance held additional instruments, passing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced efficiency of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued working with methodical precision, apparently untroubled by the fact that their patient was no longer responsive. The cover-up begins unable to witness anymore. Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. When he reached town the next morning and told his father what he'd seen, the elder Brewster feared his son had suffered a mental breakdown. "You were hunting alone in a blizzard, in the dark after tracking a wounded animal for hours," his father said carefully. "The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some kind." But Thomas's description was too detailed, too specific to dismiss as hallucination. The elder Brewster consulted with Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a cautious man who had built his reputation on careful judgment and community harmony. The Ashford sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and maintaining perfect decorum in their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families currently had daughters and wives receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned. "Accusations of this nature could destroy reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not common criminals." However, the deacon couldn't ignore such serious allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry. The investigation that failed Deacon Morrison visited the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor with perfect grace and composure, showing no sign of anxiety or guilt. When the deacon delicately mentioned that local hunters had reported unusual noises coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha's expression showed only mild concern and understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her cultured English accent, "we often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of night. The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many patients arrived in states of severe spiritual distress, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that fought desperately against the purifying power of Christian discipline. Some women have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the process of extraction requires considerable effort. The sounds your hunters heard were likely the cries of demons being cast out. Through the power of prayer and penance, the explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. Mother Superior, then, offered to show him through the upper levels of the convent. The dormitory rooms were Spartan but clean, with several women sitting in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation. But something was wrong. The women seemed unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. When Deacon Morrison attempted to make eye contact, they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if their attention was focused on something invisible in the distance. When he asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained they served as intensive spiritual counseling facilities. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures. Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption require private examination of the soul that would compromise the patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation seemed reasonable within social conventions of the time. Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured. But something continued to trouble him during the ride home. A subtle wrongness he couldn't quite identify. The women he'd observed seemed too quiet, too controlled. And there had been a smell throughout the building he couldn't quite place. Not just medicine and cleaning solutions, but something else underneath. Something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he'd visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering had been thick enough to coat the inside of his throat. Following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters implemented additional security measures. The loud screaming was replaced by an eerie silence that somehow seemed more ominous. Local families continued sending their troubled women to the convent. But observant residents began noticing disturbing patterns that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the treatments being administered. The case of Mary Prescott. Mary Prescott had been a spirited 19-year-old known throughout Millbridge for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence. She'd scandalized her family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable young men. Her mortified parents sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare her for proper married life. When Mary returned home, her parents were initially delighted by the transformation. Gone was the rebellious daughter who had argued about everything. In her place was a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when directly addressed and never expressed personal opinions or desires. She accepted the first marriage proposal that came her way with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or preference about the match. But as weeks passed, Mary's parents grew increasingly concerned. She displayed no recognition of favorite foods or cherished possessions. When shown letters she'd written before treatment, She stared at them without comprehension. She showed no emotional reaction to anything, neither joy nor sorrow. Pleasure nor pain seemed to register. She bore unusual scars on her scalp, partially hidden by hair but visible during washing when questioned about the scars. Mary showed no memory of how they'd been acquired, stating simply, "I remember nothing about my time at the convent, except praying very hard to become a better woman." Dr. Hartwell, when consulted, praised the sister's work as a complete success. The patient has been cured of the mental defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. The rebellious spirit that caused her family such distress has been completely eliminated through proper spiritual discipline. But Mary's mother noticed something Dr. Hartwell refused to acknowledge. Her daughter had been fundamentally destroyed. The vibrant young woman who had entered the convent was gone forever, replaced by a living shell that moved and breathed, but no longer truly lived. The case of Hannah Morse. Hannah Morse had been sent for treatment of melancholia following the death of her infant son. She returned after 3 months as an unnaturally cheerful woman who claimed to have no memory of ever having a child. When shown the baby's clothing and toys, she displayed no recognition or emotional response, as if that entire chapter of her life had been completely erased. The case of Elizabeth Thornton. Perhaps the most disturbing case was Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife who had been committed for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce. Scandalous behavior that threatened her family's social standing. When she returned after 4 months, she not only retracted her accusations but insisted she'd never made them. She had no memory of the events that led to her commitment. She described her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband as beyond reproach. Physical symptoms were concerning: severe headaches that left her bedridden for days, frequent confusion about basic information, forgetting names of longtime friends, becoming lost in familiar neighborhoods, struggling with simple tasks that had once been second nature, mysterious scars on her scalp with no memory of their origin, the pattern. Emerges Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had undergone treatment and returned fundamentally altered, began quietly questioning other families. She discovered a disturbing pattern. None of the women who'd received intensive treatment in basement facilities could remember anything about their time at the convent. All displayed unusual scars on their scalps in similar patterns. Many showed symptoms of brain damage, memory problems, personality changes, cognitive difficulties. Several women had simply vanished, never returning from the convent at all when families inquired about missing daughters or wives. The Ashford sisters claimed these women had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they'd chosen to remain as permanent residents, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. However, families who requested to visit these supposed residents were politely but firmly turned away, told the women had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion, prohibiting any contact with former lives. The expanding operation. The mystery deepened when Martha learned the convent was accepting women from increasingly distant locations. Wealthy families from New York elite circles in Philadelphia. Prominent households in Charleston all were apparently willing to pay substantial sums and travel great distances for the promise of complete behavioral transformation. The fees had risen dramatically. Up to $500 for comprehensive reformation typically required 6 months of treatment. Guaranteed permanent elimination of all undesirable traits and tendencies. As the convent entered its 2nd decade of operation, the Ashford sisters had established themselves as recognized authorities on feminine mental disorders throughout medical communities in both America and Europe. Their carefully crafted reputation attracted attention from some of the most prominent physicians and researchers of the era, men fascinated by the detailed case studies and remarkable success rates documented in the sisters' regular correspondence with medical institutions. The International Research Network Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School became one of their most dedicated correspondents, maintaining regular letter exchanges that lasted over 15 years. In communications preserved in Harvard archives, he expressed amazement. "Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature. The precision with which you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggests a level of understanding that our profession will not achieve for decades." What Dr. Whitmore didn't realize, he was reading clinical descriptions of procedures that would later be recognized as primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford sisters had developed sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only theorize about based on animal studies and post-mortem examinations. The experimental methodology, the sisters' research methodology, was disturbingly thorough. Phase 1. Pre-operative documentation. Detailed personality trait assessments, behavioral pattern analysis, psychological characteristic mapping, cognitive function, baseline testing, memory capability, evaluation, PAYS. 2. Surgical intervention, precise cranial entry point calculations, targeted brain tissue removal or damage, real-time response monitoring, systematic documentation of every step, anatomical mapping, and measurements, PAYS. 3. Post-operative tracking, changes in memory function, personality alterations, cognitive ability modifications, behavioral pattern shifts, long-term outcome assessment. The surgical techniques, Sister Prudence had become remarkably skilled at what she termed targeted cranial intervention, developing methods for accessing specific brain regions through carefully calculated entry points. Her detailed anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, showed various approaches to different brain structures with precise measurements and angles demonstrating sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy. The procedures themselves were conducted with clinical detachment that made them even more horrifying. Patients were typically sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but not enough to eliminate consciousness entirely. The sisters needed their subjects to remain responsive so they could monitor the effects of their interventions in real time. They would ask questions during surgery, give commands to test responses, observe changes in behavior as they manipulated different brain regions, document the immediate effects of each surgical action. The psychological warfare novice. Temperance had evolved into the group's expert on psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She developed elaborate protocols for reinforcing surgical effects through carefully designed reward and punishment systems, sensory manipulation and deprivation, psychological pressure techniques, controlled nutrition protocols, sleep deprivation regimens, temperature extreme exposure, social isolation strategies, all calibrated to break down existing personality structures and rebuild them according to desired specifications. The chemical experiments. The sisters also pioneered the use of various chemical compounds to enhance their experimental results. Through their network of medical contacts, they obtained access to substances that wouldn't be available to mainstream medicine for decades. Experimental sedatives, memory-affecting compounds, consciousness-altering drugs, behavioral modification chemicals, pain management substances. They documented effects on consciousness levels, memory formation and retention, susceptibility to psychological manipulation, pain tolerance, behavioral compliance. The statistical records by 1815, the convent had processed over 400 women through various treatment programs. The sisters maintained detailed statistical records showing success rates exceeding 90%, though their definition of success was the complete elimination of whatever personality traits or behaviors had prompted a patient's commitment. Women who died during treatment were recorded as failures and their bodies preserved for further study. The black market in human data. The scope of their operations expanded dramatically during this period. They began accepting what they termed research volunteers, typically destitute women with no family connections who were offered food, shelter, and modest compensation in exchange for participating in experimental treatments. These women, often prostitutes, vagrants, or widows with no means of support, provided the sisters with test subjects for their most experimental and dangerous procedures. The commercial enterprise, the documentation from these experiments, later, discovered in hidden archives, reveals a systematic approach to human experimentation that was both methodical and horrifying. The sisters sold their findings to medical institutions throughout the world. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became one of their most lucrative customers, paying substantial sums for detailed documentation of personality modification. Through surgical intervention, memory elimination techniques, emotional responsiveness, reduction methods, compliant behavioral state creation, the University of Edinburgh, ironically, the same institution that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan years earlier, unknowingly purchased research data from their former colleague through intermediaries. The university's medical school incorporated the Ashford findings into their curriculum, teaching surgical techniques and psychological theories based on systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. Custom behavioral modification. Perhaps most chilling of all, the sisters began accepting commissions for specific types of behavioral modification. Wealthy families could request particular personality changes, eliminating artistic interests, reducing intellectual curiosity, suppressing romantic attachments, creating perfect domestic compliance, removing political opinions, erasing specific memories. The sisters developed specialized procedures for each type of modification, charging premium prices for their increasingly sophisticated services. The careful facade that had protected the Ashford sisters for nearly 2 decades began showing its first serious cracks in the winter of 1818, when a young woman named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent. Unlike the broken, desperate women who typically sought the sisters' help, Sarah came as a fighter, possessed of an intelligence and strength of will that had not been crushed by social pressures. Sarah Whitman, the woman who refused to break Sarah's crime, was having given birth to a child out of wedlock and steadfastly refusing to reveal the father's identity, despite months of pressure from her wealthy Boston family. Her parents, prominent merchants with a reputation to protect, initially attempted to arrange a discreet marriage or adoption. When Sarah rejected both options, insisting on her right to keep her child and live independently, they declared her mentally unstable and arranged for her commitment to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At 24 years old, Sarah possessed a formidable intellect. Her progressive parents had provided an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her era, including exposure to medical texts through her father's connections with Boston physicians. This background gave her knowledge that would prove crucial to recognizing the true nature of the Ashford sisters' activities. Recognizing the horror from the moment of her arrival, Sarah understood the convent was not what it appeared to be. Other residents moved with mechanical precision of people whose personalities had been fundamentally altered. Their responses were unnaturally controlled. Their eyes were disturbingly vacant. Many bore visible scars on their scalps. Several displayed clear symptoms of brain damage, speech difficulties, memory problems, personality changes so dramatic they seemed like entirely different people. Sarah's medical knowledge allowed her to recognize these symptoms for what they were: the results of deliberate surgical intervention in the brain, the preliminary torture. During her first week, Sarah was subjected to preliminary examinations that preceded all intensive treatments. Detailed skull measurements, extensive questioning about personality traits and behaviors, physical tests designed to map neurological responses. The Ashford sisters were initially puzzled by Sarah's resistance to their standard conditioning procedures. Most patients, already broken by social shame and family rejection, quickly submitted to the convent's authority. Sarah maintained her defiance even under increasingly harsh treatment, solitary confinement for days at a time, food and water deprivation, hours of psychological abuse designed to destroy self-worth, sensory deprivation in total darkness, temperature extremes to break physical resistance, sleep disruption to weaken mental defenses, constant verbal assault on her character, and Worth's sister Temperance employed every technique in her arsenal to break Sarah's will. Through it all, Sarah remained alert and determined to escape. The secret documentation. She used her time in isolation to mentally map the convent's layout, memorize the sisters' routines, plan her eventual flight to freedom, begin documenting observations. Most importantly, she began keeping a makeshift journal, written on scraps of paper with ink made from berry juice, hidden in the seams of her clothing. The breakthrough. Sarah's opportunity came during a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when flooding in the basement disrupted normal operations. The sisters were forced to relocate equipment and patients to higher floors, creating chaos that gave Sarah the chance she'd been waiting for. In the confusion, she slipped away from her guards and began exploring areas normally strictly forbidden to patients. The discovery. What she found in the basement chambers exceeded her worst fears. Operating tables. Equipped with restraints designed to immobilize patients completely, positioned under bright lamp arrays, surrounded by drainage systems for blood and fluids. Surgical instruments collections unlike anything in conventional medicine. Specialized tools for cranial procedures. Devices designed specifically for brain tissue manipulation. Preserved specimens. Human brain tissue floating in glass jars, each carefully labeled with patient names, dates, and procedural notes, showing systematic removal from different brain regions. Surgical records, documenting procedures Sarah recognized as deliberate brain damage. Systematic removal of brain tissue from specific regions. Careful observations about resulting personality and memory changes. Detailed sketches of opened skulls. Anatomical diagrams showing precise surgical intervention locations. Correspondence files, letters from European physicians purchasing research data, commercial transactions discussing experimental results and anatomical specimens, evidence of an international network buying human experimentation data, patient catalog listing over 600 women processed since 1798, majority marked reformed and returned, surgically modified and sent home, smaller number listed as permanent residents, current whereabouts unspecified. Nearly 200 entries marked expired, died during or after experimental procedures. The desperate escape. Armed with this knowledge and samples of documentation concealed on her person, Sarah began planning her escape with desperate urgency. She knew she was scheduled for intensive treatment within days. This would likely leave her as damaged as other women. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The sisters were becoming increasingly suspicious. The escape attempt came on a moonless night in early April 1819. Sarah managed to overpower a guard and flee into the surrounding forest. The Ashford sisters immediately organized a massive search effort, knowing Sarah possessed information that could destroy their operation. 3 days of terror. For 3 harrowing days, Sarah evaded capture while making her way through wilderness toward the nearest settlement. She survived on spring water. Whatever edible plants she could identify, sheer determination to expose the truth. The sisters' pursuit was relentless and well-organized. They knew the terrain intimately and had resources to mount a comprehensive manhunt that included local men hired under the pretense of searching for a mentally disturbed woman who might harm herself. Sarah could hear her pursuers throughout her flight, their calls echoing through the forest as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. On the second night, she was nearly recaptured when she stumbled into a search party while seeking shelter from a rainstorm. Only quick thinking and childhood knowledge of the forest allowed her to evade detection. She spent the remainder of the night hiding in a fallen tree, listening to pursuers search the area around her hiding place. On the morning of the fourth day, Sarah Whitman stumbled out of the forest near the town of Macabre, a larger settlement 40 miles from the convent. She was barely conscious, severely dehydrated, covered in scratches and bruises, and suffering from exposure. The local physician, Dr. Charles Henderson, immediately recognized that this was no ordinary case of a disoriented traveler. Sarah's condition told a disturbing story. Evidence of prolonged malnutrition suggesting systematic starvation, bruising patterns consistent with restraints and physical abuse, psychological trauma manifesting as extreme vigilance and fear, scars on her wrists from extended periods of being bound, signs of sleep deprivation torture. But what truly alarmed Dr. Henderson was Sarah's level of terror. She refused to sleep, convinced the Ashford sisters would find her. She kept repeating, "They're cutting into women's brains. They're destroying their minds. Someone has to stop them." The skeptical authorities, Dr. Henderson contacted Sheriff William Bradshaw, a practical man who had heard rumors about the convent, but dismissed them as frontier superstition and religious prejudice against the English sisters. When Sarah began describing what she'd witnessed, the sheriff's initial reaction was predictable skepticism. "Ma'am, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Sometimes the mind creates elaborate stories to make sense of trauma. Perhaps the treatments were harsh, but these are respected religious women applying modern medical techniques. Sarah cut him off with fury that shocked both men. They are not religious women. They are surgeons conducting illegal human experiments. I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. I have proof." From her clothing, she produced the crumpled, stained documents she'd concealed during her escape, surgical records describing brain tissue removal, patient lists with hundreds of names, letters discussing the commercial sale of experimental data, anatomical sketches showing opened skulls. The documents were partially damaged by her journey through the wilderness, but still legible enough to be deeply disturbing. The hidden journal most damning of all was Sarah's secretly maintained journal, berry juice ink on torn fabric and paper scraps, documenting daily observations of other patients' conditions, overheard conversations between the sisters, details about scheduled treatments, names of women who had entered the convent but never emerged, descriptions of basement surgical facilities, evidence of systematic torture and experimentation. Dr. Henderson, who had medical training, examined the documents with growing horror. The surgical techniques described were far beyond anything practiced in legitimate American medicine, and the casual documentation of procedures that deliberately damaged human brains was unlike anything he'd encountered. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I believe this woman is telling the truth." These documents describe systematic human experimentation on a scale I can barely comprehend. The investigation begins. Sheriff Bradshaw faced a dilemma. The Ashford sisters had operated for 21 years with the support of prominent families throughout New England. Attacking them based on the testimony of a single troubled woman could destroy his career. But the documentation was undeniable, and Sarah's knowledge of medical terminology and surgical procedures was far beyond what an ordinary woman of her era would possess, suggesting she had indeed witnessed exactly what she claimed. The sheriff contacted the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, which dispatched investigators to interview Sarah extensively. For 3 days, they questioned her about every detail: the layout of the convent, the appearance of the surgical facilities, the names and conditions of other patients, the procedures she'd witnessed or learned about, the correspondence with European medical institutions, the financial arrangements with wealthy families. His testimony was consistent, detailed, and horrifyingly plausible. Cross-referencing the victims, investigators began the painstaking work of tracking down families who had sent women to the convent of eternal tears. What they discovered confirmed Sarah's account. Mary Prescott showed all the symptoms Sarah had described: blank affect, memory loss, personality erasure, unexplained scalp scars. Hannah Morse, complete memory loss of her deceased child. Cognitive difficulties, emotional flatness. Elizabeth Thornton, severe headaches. Confusion, personality changes, suspicious scars. Rebecca Goodwin, returned from the convent unable to recognize her own mother for several days. Each case followed the same disturbing pattern. Women with strong personalities, opinions, or rebellious tendencies entered the convent and returned as compliant shells, if they returned at all. The missing women even. More alarming were the cases of women who had simply vanished. Investigators compiled a list of 47 women who had entered the convent but never returned home. When families inquired, they were told these women had chosen religious life and taken vows of silence and seclusion. But attempts to visit these supposed permanent residents were always refused. And none of the women had ever sent letters or messages to their families. Highly unusual even for the strictest religious orders. The obvious implication: these women had died during experimental procedures, and their bodies had been disposed of. The conspiracy widens as the investigation expanded. Evidence emerged of a conspiracy far larger than anyone had imagined. Dr. Samuel Hartwell had been receiving substantial monthly payments in exchange for referring patients and providing medical supplies. His financial records showed income far exceeding what a frontier physician could earn through legitimate practice. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard had unknowingly incorporated human experimentation data into his teaching and published research, giving academic credibility to techniques developed through systematic torture. European medical institutions had been purchasing detailed anatomical data and surgical findings that could only have been obtained through unrestricted human experimentation. Prominent families throughout New England had essentially paid for their daughters and wives to be lobotomized, deceived by scientific-sounding language that disguised deliberate brain damage as modern treatment. The scope was staggering. The Ashford sisters had created an international network built on human suffering, operating for over 2 decades while hiding behind the respectability of religious authority and progressive medicine. The public outcry. When news of the investigation leaked to the press in May 1819, public reaction was explosive. Newspapers throughout America ran sensational headlines. House of Horrors, secret brain surgery, convent exposed. Religious fraud, mass medical torture. Hundreds of women victims of illegal experiments. Families who had sent women to the convent were horrified to learn they had unknowingly subjected their daughters and wives to experimental brain surgery disguised as spiritual treatment. The revelation sparked intense public debate about the lack of medical regulation and oversight, the vulnerability of women in a society that granted families absolute authority over female relatives, the dangers of unregulated medical experimentation, the need for legal protections against human rights. Abuses. The Raiden, June 15, 1819. Sheriff Bradshaw led a force of 30 armed men to raid the convent of Eternal Tears. What they found exceeded even Sarah's disturbing testimony. The basement surgical theater contained multiple operating tables with restraint systems, extensive collections of surgical instruments, preserved brain tissue specimens from dozens of victims, detailed anatomical drawings showing experimental procedures, correspondence documenting the international sale of research data, financial records revealing the scope of the commercial operation. Most horrifying of all, they found 12 women in various stages of treatment, some recovering from recent surgery, others awaiting procedures that would have destroyed their minds. All showed signs of severe psychological and physical trauma. Several were barely conscious from drug administration. At least 3 displayed fresh surgical wounds on their scalps, the sisters. Fate, but the Ashford sisters themselves were nowhere to be found. Evidence suggested they had fled several days before the raid, possibly warned by one of their many influential supporters, who learned of the investigation. Massive manhunt was launched throughout New England and beyond. Authorities searched ports, questioned ship captains, tracked overland routes. The sisters had simply vanished, taking with them substantial funds and likely false identification documents that would allow them to establish new identities. Despite extensive efforts, they were never captured. Rumors persisted for decades about sightings in Remote European medical institutions, South American settlements, Canadian frontier territories, Caribbean islands, but none were ever confirmed. The three women who had conducted systematic human experimentation on hundreds of victims had escaped justice, free to potentially continue their horrific work elsewhere under different names. Sarah's legacy. Sarah Wittmann spent the rest of her life advocating for medical reform and women's rights. She testified before state legislatures, wrote extensively about her experiences, and became a powerful voice for legal protections against medical abuse. Her courage in escaping and exposing the Ashford sisters prevented countless future victims from suffering the same fate, but she carried the psychological scars of her experience until her death in 1867. At age 72, in her final years, she wrote, "I survived the convent of eternal tears, but I will never be free of the screams I heard in those basement chambers. The convent of eternal tears represents one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, a systematic program of human experimentation that operated for over 20 years, destroyed hundreds of lives, and was enabled by a society that granted unlimited power over women deemed troublesome by their families. The case led to some of the first medical regulation laws in American history and contributed to growing awareness of human rights and medical ethics. But the Ashford sisters were never caught. They escaped justice and potentially continued their horrific work elsewhere. This is the true story that authorities tried to bury for over a century. If this story disturbed you, you're not alone. These historical horrors demand our attention so we can ensure they never happen again. What did you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more true crime documentaries exposing the darkest mysteries from American history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.